January is almost over, but it isn't there yet. And in the short amount of time that we have been in 2023, there have already been over 40 mass shootings. And we are well aware or well ahead of eclipsing all previous records on the calendar. And this is not a record that should be beat. There have been plenty of shootings for me to raise my voice about that have already occurred this year and last. Why now? Why from the pulpit? Well, there is something out there that is unnerving me more than the previous shootings. And that's the lack of outrage, the lack of condemnation that I'm seeing around us. Sure, the news is reporting it, but as a whole, unless I'm not plugged into the right media sources, it seems to be falling on deaf ears. I'm not even hearing people say thoughts and prayers anymore, but just dead silence. Playing on the screen now, for the duration of my sermon, is a list of all the mass shootings that have been recorded in this country since the 1920s. You'll notice two things. The first is, within two sentences, we've left the 1920s. But you'll notice the number of shootings for a decade will soon be replaced with the number of shootings in a year. And then you'll notice the shootings in a year will start getting longer and longer. As you watch the screen, I want you to look for shootings that you recall being ones that felt like turning points for you, ones that are seared into your mind when you thought this is the last straw and society will change, then realize that it had no effect whatsoever. Remember the indignation, the anger, the burning desire to get something done, and then ask yourself, where was the line that we as a society drew? What was the year when we gave up any hope of being able to solve this? When did our hearts dry up and become hard? Because as a whole, society's heart has been hardened. We hear that phrase for the first time this week in our Torah portion, Parashat Bo, where God says, Kibadati libo, for I, Adonai, have hardened his, Pharaoh's, heart. Pharaoh, on the verge of letting the Israelites go, has had his heart hardened by God, which forces another set of plagues to occur. The rabbis speculate tremendously on why God did this. Was it to make Pharaoh an even opponent? Was it because the plagues needed to happen so that God's might could be on display in all its glory on the world stage? Hear me, that I am God, and fear me. Ultimately, this hardening of hearts leads Moses to ask on behalf of God, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Now, we can talk theology about hardening the heart of Pharaoh and God's role in it all you want tonight. And we can talk about it over and over again and run in circles, but it would just take away from a simple truth. Things happen, and sometimes we act against our own self-interest. There are so many things that happen in this world that are random, and we just call them an act of God, even though God had nothing to do with them. We had a miserable rain Wednesday night, and through an act of God, our roof leaked in the worst leak I have seen in, ever. and it won't be fixed for weeks. Was that leak actually God sending us a message by way of plague? No. By the way, our Buildings and Grounds Committee do view the roof as a plague, an eternal plague. But it wasn't God that did it. Why does this text say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Personally, my midrash, my interpretation, is that God did no such thing. But the authors of the text couldn't wrap their minds around how Pharaoh could have been so stubborn in the face of God's power. I would be good with seeing a staff turn into a snake. I'd see that happen. It would eat the other snakes. I'm good. The slaves can get on the next caravan after Goshen. You're free to go. But not for this Pharaoh. So the plagues went on. How on earth could anyone not give in to that? God must have intervened. God must have, kibbadati libo, hardened his heart. As outsiders, we look at what's happening within Egypt and we attribute God to Pharaoh's stubbornness, because what else could explain a country working against its own self-interest in such an obvious way? Look at that plague. Look at the pain. Look at the death. Look at the misery. Why would they do that and ignore their own self-interest? That, by the way, is how other nations look to us when mass shootings occur constantly, and we do nothing to try and temper them. There is no rational explanation as to why our hearts have been hardened to such catastrophe other than the unexplainable. What caused us to become so closed off to a possible answer? The truth is, very rarely do we actively choose to flip a switch and turn off emotions. Something always happens, and as a defense mechanism, we try to protect ourselves. It's like each and every one of those shootings going by on the screen gives our heart another layer of calluses until we can't feel them anymore. We have resigned ourselves to the idea that nothing can be done, that it's too difficult to think about, that there are too many guns already. It's too complicated to solve. Why bother? We can't stop it. There are so many different factors that are part of what's going on. And I've heard from the most liberal to the most conservative what they believe the causes are. What I don't want to do tonight is engage in a debate about Second Amendment rights. I'm not going to advocate the logistics behind taking away America's guns. First, I don't believe that it's practical or achievable, but I also believe that if we focus on that and that alone, we miss the very real points about how we are ignoring a mental health crisis in America, or how we're dealing a rage crisis or an anger crisis. I cannot, however, escape the inescapable fact that studies have consistently found that places with more guns have more violent deaths, that the more guns there are in an area, the higher the local suicide rates are, and that, as David Hemingway, who was the director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, stated, generally, if you live in a civilized society, more guns mean more death, and there is no evidence that having more guns reduces crime, none at all. But that's not my point tonight. When we wrestle with what to say, considering these shootings, I look to the wisdom of our sages, who had mixed emotions when grappling with weapons. Our sages didn't live in a world that contained guns. The very notion that there could be a device out there like an AR-15 would have been mind-boggling for them. Therefore, none of the writings would ever mention anything that could snuff out human life with either that large a scale or with that amount of ease. What they do write about were the equivalents of their day and how we should regulate weapons. We don't actually see a reference of weapons in the Torah until we come across Lamech, Adam and Eve's great-grandson and father of Noah. It's noted in the Torah that Lamech learned how to forge weapons. With this mention that weapons were being brought into the world, Ramban extrapolates a midrash that states that as Lamech prepared to forge swords, his wives began to protest because they were afraid. They were afraid because now that we would have the skills to make swords, death would readily enter the world. Within Ramban's midrash, Lamech responded to his wives, reminding them that murder existed well before he started creating swords. To turn a modern phrase, swords don't kill people, people kill people. However, in our Torah, Lamech boasts that I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then mine is 77-fold. For me, this teaches us that if we focus only on guns and not the anger and the hatred and the vitriol that lends a shooter to action, then nothing will change. Just the means of which someone who intends to do harm will do harm. The rabbis were aware of the dangers of swords and daggers, which is why they made the sale of weapons heavily regulated. In fact, according to Avodah Zarah, one could only sell weapons to a friendly neighbor or to an allied nation, and it was explicitly written that one could not sell to someone who has committed murder or was a cowardly thief. Why one couldn't sell to a murderer should be clear, but why to a coward? They teach that you can't sell a sword to a coward because you can't predict what his behavior might be when he is in a stressful or panic-stricken situation. In other words, the rabbis understood that a sword in the right hands would cause no harm and could be useful and a necessary tool. However, in the wrong hands, it could be disastrous. I imagine sages probably wouldn't advocate for the removal of guns, but would advocate for strict policies that would ensure only the right people could obtain them, which is something we are failing miserably at doing. In addition, we often, far too often, get focused on guns. Guns are an easy, inanimate thing for us to focus on. They are the problem. They are the cause. Let's just get rid of them and everything will be fine. But to me, that's putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Instead, I think we need to focus on a different question of why so many people are wanting to hurt others. What can we do to help the hurt and the pain? What are we doing that is preventing individuals from learning lessons about how to properly treat others? What is causing so much rage in society? There seems to be no area of life, perhaps except for within these walls, but there seems to be no area of life where anger doesn't flow on tap towards others. From how we interact as drivers in cars, to how people treat workers in the customer service industry, as you can tell by all those Karen videos online, to how we process pain, we seem to have no problem lashing out at anyone who looks at us sideways. Our hearts have become made of stone, and we seem to have no problem hurting others. How long will we refuse to humble ourselves and start caring for one another, the stranger and the neighbor alike? How many more entries will it take until we start working in society's self-interest rather than against it? At what time will we no longer study war anymore and start working in harmony to care for one another?
ייסגוי אל גוי חרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה. לא ייסגוי אל גוי חרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה. לא ייסגוי אל גוי חרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה. לא ייסגוי אל גוי חרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה. Nation shall not lift up their swords, they shall not learn the ways of war. Nation shall not lift up their swords, they shall not learn the ways of war. Every wind beneath the vine and fig tree, every soul that's singing for humanity, everyone must lay down their swords. Every town that's struck down by a tragedy, every branch that's broken off a family tree, everyone must lay down their swords. Every dreamer dreaming of a better day, every leader preaching there's a better way, everyone must lay down their swords. Every conscious call for civility, every hero exhibiting humility, everyone must lay down their swords. Lo yisagoi el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Lo yisagoi el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Nation shall not lift up their swords, they shall not learn the ways of war. Nations shall not lift up their swords, they shall not learn the ways of war. Everyone beneath the vine and fig tree, every soul that's singing for humanity, everyone must lay down their swords. Every town that's struck down by a tragedy, every branch that's broken off a family tree, everyone must lay down their swords. Every dreamer's dreaming of a better day, every leader preaching there's a better way, everyone must lay down their swords. Every conscious calling liberty, every hero exhibiting humility, everyone must lay down their sword. Lo, 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 lo.
Shabbat Shalom.